Good morning or good evening, wherever you are. Thank you for inviting me to speak at the Higher Education Summit on transformative learning in higher education. And I just will take 15 minutes to briefly introduce some of my ideas, ideas that have developed over time at Wageningen University and other places where I've been working and I'm still working, like the University of Gothenburg in Sweden and currently at the Norwegian Life Science University, and of course as a UNESCO chair. I would like to talk about connecting in times of distancing, polarization, and urgency. What role does higher education have in restoring the Earth and becoming more or less dysfunctional on this fragile planet? And these challenges are enormous, and they call for, I would say, a more radical reorientation than we may have been advocating so far. Okay, let me speed up a little bit. In general, I think we recognize that we live in a complex and uncertain world, and that's inevitable. And it's not so much taming it or reducing it; it's more about learning to live with it, and that's the task of higher education as well. The extinction of truth and the loss of trust is something we need to be aware of. How can we connect with people, rebuild trust, develop relationships that restore that? But also, how can we utilize ambiguity as a source for discussion, debate, dialogue, rather than as something that we need to be avoiding? There's also the issue of hyperconnectivity through social media, and which can lead to a kind of an addiction to technologies, which can lead to a loss of place and identities that are being hijacked in these fora by forces that may not have the interest of people and planet in mind. Can lead to viral nonsense. Critical media literacy is an important part of higher education. How to contribute to that is another question. We need to be very critical of the economic logic of which the university often has become a part, where students are input, throughput, output, where teachers are being judged by their efficiency of getting students through by increasing their H factor in publishing. It is very much a culture of counting and measuring, while the most important, perhaps, things in life and into becoming sustainable cannot be measured. And this is another challenge, to rethink the dominant way of accounting and to express and using metrics for indicating success. We need to radically overhaul those as well. And how do we deal with despair, apocalyptic futures, and so on? That's something else that we need to be addressing. Hopeful perspectives, co-creation of alternative futures, looking for examples elsewhere in the world or maybe locally that are able to disrupt some of these trends and patterns and systems that are deeply ingrained, unfortunately, in our current society. How do we decolonize, or how do we deconstruct them and recreate healthier ones? All of this requires a continuous learning or a reflexive perspective, where we recognize that sustainability is an emergent property of how we act and what we do, and where we need to be experimenting and trying new things out and reflecting on what's working, what's not working, what's pushing back, what's slowing us down, what are the barriers, what's working with us. So what kind of powers are in place that might be resilient but need to be changing. And it's not just about adapting to the changing world all the time, it's also about disrupting the structures that hold things in place sometimes. So resilience can also be an unhealthy thing in that sense. Of course, young people are responding, and students in particular. There are all kinds of movements that call for alternative ways of teaching and learning and engaging in the real issues of today's world that are deeply existential issues. Extinction Rebellion, Fridays for Future for Friday movements. There's transition movements all around the world trying to localize food systems, to get more locally sustainable food energy cooperatives. Sharing economies are emerging. So there is an attempt to kind of rebuild societies, rebuild schools, institutions, based on alternative values that are not values of competition and continuous growth, but are looking for more a dynamic equilibria with sometimes sustainable growth, sometimes sustainable contraction, where we try to constantly recreate, redesign the world around us, and pay attention to our inner well-being, our inner sustainability, as well as our outer sustainability, the environments, the communities that we live in. And students and teachers and universities and schools have a critical role to play in this what you might call sustainability movement. And here you see some of these initiatives and the different kinds of mechanisms that are around at the moment. And if they can all kind of coagulate or in a synergetic way come together, then it could lead to a force, transition force that is much needed as the urgency of say climate change is increasing and the window for learning, co-creation is shrinking. So this is something we need to be mindful of too. How do we maintain these spaces for joint learning, for interaction, social learning, democracy open, as the urgency to do something increases and the risk towards an eco-totalitarian response increases. And this is something to be discussed as well. It's good to always ask the question, what is education for? And here are three ways of discussing this and to talk about this. Gert Bista, Dutch fellow Dutch pedagogue, education philosopher, talks about these three functions: socialization, what's worth handing over in a way, what are the kinds of values, social norms and predicaments that we as a society find critical and need to be shared. Subjectification has more to do with becoming who we are, who we want to be, unfolding our own potential and qualities, and not being molded in a particular way of living or being becoming a diligent, disciplined citizen who is a good consumer, for instance. The freedom to learn, to become who you are, is subjectification, and qualification has to do with the capacities, the skills that we need to function well in society. And of course, Gert Bista did not look at this from say a sustainability perspective. If we would do that, we could add eco to this from an ecological and eco-social perspective. What does this mean? Socialization and subjectification and qualification. What kinds of constraints, but also what kinds of possibilities does a more ecological perspective add to these three? And that's something to think about. And Kate Raworth's donut economy in a way helps with this, because she points out we need to learn to live within that ecological ceiling, within the carrying capacity of the earth, while being mindful of the foundations, the social foundations, and kind of the when we talk about access to food and health and good education and having political voice and gender equality, those are kind of the foundations that we need to establish in order to live well, and within that safe and just space for humanity. The donut economy is getting more traction also in schools of businesses, fortunately. And the Sustainable Development Goals obviously are an important mechanism for many schools, universities, and countries. They can be a catalyst for these kinds of transitions, but we must also be mindful that they can too be co-opted by corporate interests. And some of these goals you might also want to critique from that perspective. Decent work and economic growth, for instance. Why is growth the mantra always? And maybe it's decent work and a circular economy would have been maybe more in tune with sustainability. But that's just an example. So some of these goals are kind of at the middle, establishing the foundations, the social foundations. Some are more on the outside, but they help us kind of think in a more holistic, integrative way, unless we all pick our own goals and then run with those. The key, I think, is to think of them in a connected way and not to try to dissect them and to piece them up into small units and indicators and so on, because then we're basically practicing reductionism 2 or 3.0. What are some qualities that we need in higher education, and what do we need to pay attention to if we want to contribute to more sustainable ways of being and living? In earlier work and presentations and papers, I make a distinction between, 5 critical components. One is we need to deal with values and ethics. We need to engage with moral dilemmas and not shy away from them. We need to utilize diversity, and when we don't have enough of it, we need to look for it actively and invite it. But we need to have social relationships to make full use of that. Without the social relationships and the cohesion between different people and groups in society, diversity can become a problem, as we also see around the world. We need agency. We need to have the willingness, capacity, and the space to make change. How do we engage people in making change? And how do we create space for action in schools, in universities? And how do we reflect critically on what is changing and what is transitioning, what is holding us back? That's the change and transition component. When are we optimizing something, and when do we need to radically rethink the underlying assumptions, values, principles to create new ones? And boundary crossing and systems thinking are inevitably important, as we are very good in reducing the world into smaller pieces and categories and boxes, bubbles, and so on. But the key towards a more sustainable world is seeing the connections, how everything is interdependent, how the whole is more than the sum of its parts. This kind of systemic, integrative, holistic way of thinking is not much cultivated in our schools and universities. All this together needs to be organized in a kind of an ecological way. And that is the last thing I'd like to talk about, as I've already gone way over time and may have lost some of you by now. But I think it's very important to think more ecologically and in more blended ways about teaching, learning, and capacity building. For one, we need to seriously look at the filters through which we see the world. What are the different perspectives people bring to the table? How do they frame issues? What language do they use? What are the values underneath? Eliciting those, exposing them, confronting them, and seeing what connects us and maybe what makes us different is important in this. In our exposing, eliciting these different filters and perspectives, we can use media, we can use technology, we can use language. We have different conduits for learning. Basically, we need to utilize all of them in a good, balanced way. And then, of course, there's all kinds of mechanisms for learning that we tend to kind of separate. But there is the possibility of online communities, which through the pandemic at the moment is maybe emphasized. ICT supported learning, the use of things like Zoom, Google Hangout, Adobe Connect, and so on. Is growing at the moment, but at the same time we need to also be asking, What does it mean for utilizing outdoor learning spaces, healthier spaces outdoors, and using the outdoors as a living laboratory, as a classroom, and maybe we should look into that more as a response to COVID-19, but that could also be, without even the pandemic being there, that is a critical component of learning, using the outdoors, and urban or non-urban outdoor environments. They're all critical places for learning in a more relational and in a more embodied way. Self-learning, games, simulation, mentoring, apprenticing, citizen science as a way to gather information about the state of our own health or the state of the health of our community, of biodiversity, and so on, can really actively engage people in science, help them understand science better, and can help establish trust between science and society. So that's also important. And all these relations, and the synergy between them require that we, as teachers, as facilitators, find a good way to blend these and to connect these, and all together they will be needed in co-creating transitions towards sustainability. Then there are different dimensions. We all know or heard of the Delors report. It goes back quite some time, and these learnings, learning to care, learning to do, and so on, are critical. I've added learning to transform and maybe learning to transgress, because we also need to learn to kind of disrupt the structures and routines and systems that are inherently unsustainable. And that requires counter-hegemonic or going against the grain, asking difficult questions, and going, stepping outside the comfort zone in order to do that. Then there are these levers, what I would call levers, and I referred to them earlier. They are all kind of stepping stones needed together in order to get transitions going and to help them, to support them. The boundary crossing, the agency, the ethics, and the diversity, um, and the transition thinking plays a big role in that. Now, this connecting all these filters, mechanisms, and so on does lead to a kind of confusing, maybe, system, if you will, which cannot be reproduced in practice in this way, but it does serve as a kind of a reminder about the complexity of learning and teaching and capacity building, and that we have lots of possibilities that we can use, but we only tend to use a few of them, and we tend to focus on data, information, and knowledge, maybe understanding, but not so much on meaning and wisdom. For instance, learning to know, learning to do are quite common, but learning to care, learning to be, learning to transform are not so much used in or focused on. So we need to use something like this as a kind of a heuristic, a thinking tool to think, where can we do more? What can we connect to this? Where do we see spaces for that can open up this more ecological way of learning, a more holistic, integrated way of learning? It helps to understand in all these transitions and transition pathways. These transitions, these deeper changes, they usually start in niches, in small niches, where people try out new things. They kind of resist the current situation, and they see the need for a more radical shift in values and principles. And when these niches kind of are connected with each other, they can strengthen each other, and they can accelerate to become a kind of a regime at the meso level. And eventually, when new forms of norms and practices and cultures and ethos are firmly established, the whole landscape can shift. And this can start small. It can start with guerrilla gardening. It can start, and then that can be upscaled to neighborhoods having spaces for community gardening, connecting with local farmers, maybe connecting with schools, but also with elderly and so on, intergenerational learning. And then eventually the whole city can transform into a more green city, where it's no longer about just food, but also about mobility, water, energy, and so on. And in a way, a transition in education itself can also go in that way, where we have niches of students often, or faculty, who want to redesign their teaching and learning and experiment in labs, living labs, challenge labs, and so on, starting with the local environment, connecting them with global issues and globalization, trying to redesign, co-create new practices, learning from the attempt, and having this kind of multi-stakeholder environment as a learning laboratory. And that can lead to, we can see all kinds of indicators for how this can be successful. Is there the diversity of actors? Is it increasing? Is there more policy support for this? Is it becoming normalized, this new way of thinking and acting, and these new values that we are trying to amplify and develop together? Are there cultural shifts? Are there signs of transgression, and so on? So we need to also look for different kinds of indicators, and these urban living labs that are quite popular, are almost cliche, but they do represent an effort to leave kind of the ivory tower, and to connect with citizens and stakeholders, and to connect with the deep and urgent sustainability challenges that we are facing. And these need not just be in urban settings, obviously. And often it is blended setting. The urban-rural divide is also in a way artificial. So these living labs for sustainable development, you might call them, are experimental, often temporary ecologies of learning that engage multiple stakeholders in the co-creation and testing and evaluating of solutions to sustainability challenges in a real world, authentic kind of setting. And the learning questions and learning outcomes are often determined by the stakeholders themselves, and not prescribed or pre-designed by teachers or staff, but the teachers and the staff, the teaching staff, has more a role in creating the space for this type of learning and engaging students actively in these ecologies, and helping them, supporting their learning, connecting them with the right knowledge that might be relevant, but also sharing their own expertise in the area, so they become more facilitators, brokers, coaches of learning, and also helping them reflect on what is happening, what is changing in them, how things are changing in the system. And that's another important role, new role, I think, for university staff in this kind of setting. And there are indicators. I think this is from the T-Learning project. Transgressivelearning.org is the site where you'll find some of this. There are different kinds of indicators. I wouldn't call them indicators even. I call them signs. So signs of creativity, we should look for that. Signs of conviction, for intuitive action, new friendships, attentiveness, empathy. Signs for conflict and tension that can lead to a heightened awareness and a deeper desire to look for more, to find joint facts, to deepen the inquiry, so to say. Signs of a joint sense of purpose. So these are all kinds of indicators that we need to be looking for, that can tell if these learning ecologies are actually moving towards a more sustainable way of acting and living and doing. It's just a matter of going to the portal, if you Google MSP Guide Wageningen, you will get to that portal, and you can find lots of other resources as well. Another one comes from the Rural Sociology Group and the project Susplace, European project, where they look at arts-based methods for transformative engagement. I think the arts need to be coming in much more than has been the case so far. We tend to shy away from that in higher education for some reason. We tend to emphasize the cognitive, and we kind of ignore the passion and the emotion. And maybe Mandy Singer will be talking about this a bit more as well. And we might pick up on that in our dialogue during the conference. So let me end, as I've already more than doubled the time. Some key interrelated questions. I'm not going to give you answers, but So questions like how can systemic and transitional forms of education for sustainability be best designed, organized, supported, and evaluated? And there are lots of ideas about this emerging all around the world. So, and I can share some of them maybe during the conference. What are the implications of a more ecological approach to teaching and learning? Also for teacher training and professional development of staff. How can universities and all the actors in the system become more relational, connect more to place, the local environment, to local people, other species, but also to the material environment around us. What does a more relational pedagogy entail or require? ICT, it's inevitable, it's around us, we cannot ignore it, but how can we prevent it from accelerating unsustainability? How can we not just look at big data, but also look at small data, where people collect their own data through, for instance, citizen science or civic science, investigating their own local possibilities for change and transitions in food, energy, water, and so on, while collaborating with scientists and with policymakers and becoming more understanding of the power of knowledge, inquiry, discovery, reflection, and also trust, building trust in science. Lastly, how can universities connect better with all these transitions that are happening all around us, but we're not really tapping into them much as a university? These are excellent places for learning. There's lots of experimenting going on. How can our students and staff participate in them, and how can these transitions benefit from the enormous capacity available within universities? So it's a synergetic relationship that we need to be enabling, facilitating, supporting. Okay, that's it from me. I hope I haven't overloaded you with too many ideas and concepts. You probably left with lots of questions, which is the point of my talk. Some answers I can provide maybe during the session or via email, or some answers you might be found on my blog, transformativelearning.nl. And feel free to contact me also via email if you like. Thank you, and I hope you will be inspired by the conference and the other speakers as well. And it's an important task ahead of all of us. We can no longer make piecemeal changes or ad hoc changes in higher education. The current predicament of humanity and the consequences it has for other species and the future of this planet calls for a more radical response. And we have a big responsibility as people, privileged people participating in events like this, to be at the forefront of designing, generating such a radical response. Thank you.